All right, guys, welcome back to the Patreon. My sincerest apologies for the long delay between lessons, a lot of traveling, a lot of other stuff going on that just hasn't been conducive to me doing these lessons. So I apologize. I actually have a whole series planned to make up all the lost time to you guys. I think I missed two lessons in the last 2 months. And so I'm going to double up and do four short classes this month. And that's going to be the start of a series that I have planned on modes, modal scales, and modal chords, which really has been something. First time I ever introduced modes to the Patreon was 15 months ago. And in the process of researching that lesson was actually the first time that I ever encountered modes as a musician. And they have profoundly changed the way that I write music. I use them in almost every song, and some of my favorite tracks from the last year are modal tracks. So I don't know if all of you were here when we did that lesson. If not, it's definitely worth going back. What I'll do is I'll actually dig it up and I'll put it pin it to the top of the Patreon page so you have it. I did a whole discussion about modes, what they are, where they come from, the history, and how we can use them. Much of that will be recapped in today's lesson, although today is very focused on one particular mode, which is Mixolydian. But in the build-up and in sort of the preamble, I'll try and explain as much as possible about what modes are and why we use them and how we use them. But yeah, it's definitely worth rewatching that lesson because there was some really cool stuff in there. Okay, so to start off, just some general points about modes, essential points about modes in general. All right, modes have a secret sound, a forgotten sound that often sounds otherworldly, ethnic, dreamy, and has very unusual qualities that are very rare in Western music and even rarer in electronic Western music. So it's exceptionally rare to hear stuff that's written in modes. There are a few really famous songs in modal keys, but the vast majority of music in the West is written in either major or minor. So that just makes modal pieces really stand out when you do use modes. Melodies from modal scales sound very otherworldly in a way that is specific to each mode. So I'll go through. Each mode has a particular quality. Like Dorian is very dreamy, Phrygian is very dark and gloomy, Locrian is very dissonant. But all modes have an otherworldly quality because there are intervals in there, interval relationships that the ear is not used to, especially if you listen to Western pop music or Western commercial music. And the third point, which is really relevant later on in the modal discussion, is that chord progressions from modal scales are not reliant on the laws of diatonic harmony. By the way, guys, there's construction at my house, and I was going to wait until I recorded this until they stop drilling, but it appears that they're not going to stop drilling. So I'll try and gate this out in post, but if you hear some drilling, some hammering, some banging, there's construction at my house. So yeah, as I was saying, modal chord progressions are not reliant on the laws of diatonic harmony. Okay, it's a large topic, as I said in the notes, but the simplest way to explain it is that modal chord progressions are more democratic, i.e. if you have a modal chord progression with 4 chords, each chord has an equal distribution of power, importance, and priority in the progression. Whereas in a conventional song in major or minor, there's a lot more importance given to 2 chords, the 1 chord and the 6 chord. And hopefully that makes sense to you at this stage of the music theory journey that we're on the Patreon. If not, check out my previous lessons on the circle and all the traditional sort of music theory stuff where I discussed the 6 chord, the 1 chord, and the importance of both in Western music. Because you're always in traditional harmony, either moving toward the 6 chord or away from it to the 1 chord. All right, the progression. The rest of the progression is sort of an afterthought. You're always waiting for this moment of resolving to the 6 or the 1. And so, like, for example, the 2 chord, its function is thought of as a sub-function of that 6 chord or the 1 chord. So the power distribution in normal chord progressions is very much distributed around the 6 chord or the 1 chord. In modal progressions, it's a different world because each chord has a democratic balance of power. So you could stay on the 3 chord for 5 minutes and it doesn't want to have the same momentum toward resolution that traditional progressions have. That's sort of like a summary of what makes modes unique, okay? And then just the essential points about dictation of modes, because in order to use modes, we've got to be able to number them and we've got to be able to understand what keys are in those modes. All right, now recall that when dictating the intervals in a modal scale, they're always dictated in terms of the major scale. Okay, so for example, the major scale dictation in C is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. All right, so that you see there's no flats or sharps, which means every single key is in its default major position. And that gives us C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and C in the key of C major. That is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Okay, so you'll probably be familiar with this. When we dictate the intervals in the minor scale, we dictate them as 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7, and 8. And that indicates that 3, 6, and 7th degrees are flatted from their position in the major to now their position in the minor, which is flat 3rd, flat 6, flat 7. But we are always comparing to the default position that the major key has, okay? So that's really important. So if I say to you in a modal scale that one of the changes we do is to flat the 2, that means we flat the 2 from its default standard unchanged position in the major key. Okay, that's really important. So one last time, when you see 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7, what mode is that? It's minor, Aeolian, but the flats are being compared to their default position in the major scale. That's really, really important. Okay, fantastic. Again, I did a modal class about 15 months ago on the Patreon. And in that class, what I did is I laid out this chart, which I'm going to revise now. And this chart is probably, for me, the clearest indication of how modes work, because it's a descending chart that starts in the most majory, the brightest, most consonant, happiest, most restful mode possible, which is actually Lydian. It's not major. You could think of it as if we're moving from the most majory mode here down through different more minory modes to the ultimate minory mode, which is Locrian. So we're moving from highly consonant, extremely balanced, restful, triumphant, happy modes down through a series of progressively darker modes till we get to Aeolian, which is standard minor. And then there's 2 degrees of, there's 2 modes that are 2 degrees darker, respectively, than the standard minor. And those are Phrygian and Locrian. Okay, so Lydian, which is the lightest mode, all right, the lightest possible mode. If you're looking for an example of Lydian, the Simpsons theme song is actually written in Lydian, all right. It's a standard major scale with a sharp 4, as we can see over here. And I'm not going to discuss that today. I just want to show you how we dictate all of these. And then we've got Ionian, which is the standard major. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. No sharps, no flats. The standard major mode that we know. And then as we move down this chart, we see that from major, at least one interval now becomes flattered as we change mode. So in Mixolydian, we've got the standard major, but the 7th is flattered. Then we move one mode darker. In Dorian, we've got 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7, and 8. So you see that there's 2 flats in Dorian as compared to the default major mode, which is Ionian. Okay, and then in Aeolian, which is minor, we've got 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7, and 8. Okay, so what I'm showing you here is that we're moving progressively from the lightest, most majory mode through a series of changes where per mode, one additional flat is added, and we start getting from a completely major mode. Mixolydian's a major mode with 1 degree of minor. Dorian is a major mode with 2 degrees of minor. Then we hit minor, and then we start flatting additional keys to make it even more minory than minor. And that's kind of what's happening on this chart, is we're moving from the lightest possible mode all the way through to the darkest possible mode, which is Locrian. Okay, I really like that, because when I've seen modes explained in music theory tutorials on the internet, it's very squirrely, to say the least. And they always do it the old school way, where C to C is Ionian, D to D is Dorian, etc. But I don't like that explanation. I way prefer to see it like this, descending from lightest to darkest with all the changes in between. Okay, fantastic. So I'll upload this in PDF and Word to the Patreon so you guys can see. It's very useful to have this, not only the dictation, but also the actual notes and intervals in each one. So now you can see that C, Aeolian, is C, D, D sharp, F, G, G sharp, A sharp, and C. Whereas C, Dorian, which has one less flat, is C, D, D sharp, F, G, A. It has the natural 6. The 6 is not flatted. A sharp and C. Okay? And then moving one degree up, which is more majory, Mixolydian, which is what we're doing today, has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7, and 8. So it's a straight up major scale that has only one degree that's different from the standard major, and that degree is the 7th. And what is the difference? The 7th is flatted from its position in the major scale. Okay, so that's it. So before we go into a whole technical analysis of Mixolydian, let me play you just a few little pieces that are written in this key. And I'll start, I downloaded a MIDI file for what I think is probably the most famous piano piece ever in Mixolydian. And it's Coldplay Clocks, which is a song I really like. Very nice musicality. I've just imported the MIDI. I've also transposed the MIDI to C, so you can see what's going on. The natural key of this is actually E flat Mixolydian, but I've transposed it to C. Okay, so have a listen. Okay, it's such an iconic piano riff. I've got it in like a really shitty Rhodes piano at the moment because I didn't have a good grand piano. But it's such an iconic riff, and what makes it so iconic is the fact that it's in this forgotten mode, Mixolydian. If we look here, we can see, by the way, the key signature of this is all the white keys, but A sharp is the differentiator key. So where we would normally have B as the 7th of C major, now we have A sharp as the flat 7. So it's a C major scale, standard issue C major scale, but the 7th is flatted to B flat or A sharp. All right. So here you can see the first chord is a C major chord, straight up, the 1 major chord, and the next chord has A sharp in the bass. It's also got it at the top, and that's what gives it that sound. All right, now as a point of comparison, what I did was I took that MIDI and I converted all the 7ths that were flatted back to the natural 7th, the major 7th. And you can hear, you can see that every single B flat has now been raised up to B, which is the natural major 7th. So this piece is now in C major. It's got the exact same progression. It's going 1, 7, 6, but it's 1, 7, 6 in major now instead of Mixolydian. Listen to the difference. Okay, it's just not the same. It doesn't have that really open sort of epic sound that the Mixolydian has, because the Mixolydian's got the happiness of the major 3rd, but it's got the complexity and the epicness of that flat 7. And you hear that in melodically, but especially when it gets to the chord progression level, you can hear how much edge it loses when we return that 7 back to the natural major 7. Okay, so there it is in major, and here it is again in Mixolydian. All right, so I think that sort of perfectly illustrates what this mode is about. It sounds like major, but it's just got a little twist because of that flat 7, and it gives it an epicness that for me, and an openness that the standard major doesn't have. Okay, so that's the deal. I'll play you another piece that I wrote, an original piece that also really illustrates what this mode is about. Intro. Okay, let me open up the MIDI of this piano. Voicing up. Okay, now we'll talk about the chord progression aspect of this later on in the lesson. I just want to look at intervals right now. You'll notice I have moved G to the bass. So there's actually a chord progression going on, a Mixolydian chord progression, where I've got the 1 chord with C in the bass, and then the 5 chord with G in the bass, okay? And that 5 chord, by the way, is minor, which again we'll discuss as we move on with the lesson. But the differentiator key that I'm looking for, the key that makes this distinctly Mixolydian, is the flat 7. And that flat 7 is A sharp or B flat. So it's only once I play that key that it becomes a Mixolydian piece. If I take away A sharp and I replace it with B, this is now in C Ionian, C standard major, all right? But if you listen, as soon as you hear this note, that's where you know it's a Mixolydian. And then you see I repeat this A sharp B flat all the way through the progression. Okay, modes, a lot of modes are about feeling, and you can hear the feeling. It's quite epic, it's quite open, it's quite thoughtful, and it's quite dreamy. The 2 modes that I feel are the dreamiest are Mixolydian and Dorian, which is like this, but slightly more minery. And they're both very floaty, very dreamlike. This would be perfect for like a dream sequence in a film score, some sort of really thoughtful moment in a film score, a documentary, etc. So yeah, and by the way, this is at 160 BPM. It sounds really good, fast, this mode. So that's that. I'll discuss this chord progression with you guys just now, but hearing this in the Coldplay song, I think you get a sort of, just like a mental impression of what Mixolydian actually sounds like and what it feels like. Also note, as I said in the beginning, there's only 2 chords in this piece, yet it feels very complete. I don't feel like I want to now go into a 5 chord progression. And in general, because the power balance, as I was saying, is very democratic in modal chord progressions, it's very possible and very practical to write modal pieces with only 2 or maximum 3 chords. I don't need 5 or 6 chords like I do in traditional linear harmony. So that's something that's very different about modal chord progressions. All right, fantastic. So let's go back to the notes and just zooming in now on the dictation and the actual intervals in this scale. Again, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7, 8, and those notes are C, D, E, F, G, A sharp, and C. Again, the 7th is flatted, and that is the differentiator key in this mode. Okay, so obviously my job is to take all this obscure stuff from the 16th century and make it applicable, relevant for dance music, for electronic music. So before we get complicated, let me play you a few pieces that are just simple little sketches that you could use as a house track, as a little sketch, as a little piece of electronic music in a live set, but they still have that distinctly Mixolydian feel. So this is quite a cool one. And it starts with this sound. Now, if you look at the intervals, again, I've just got the root note at the bottom. The root note never shifts, it's always C. And I'm arpeggiating top notes. And if you look at the intervals, it's 3, major third, 5th, the 5th note, and then the flat 7. That is the sort of differentiator key of the Mixolydian mode. So we go 1, 3, 1, 5, 1 flat 7, 1, 2, 1, 3, 1, 3, 1, 5, 1 flat 7. And the sound it gives is like this. Okay, it's got that kind of confused, thoughtful, pensive epicness. Okay, then I've got a pad layer that also contains the flat 7 just to drive home that we're in this mode. Okay, a little bit of bass and some drums. And it sounds really cool when this filter just opens and closes. Okay, now note that there is no chord progression here. Again, all the bass voicing is just sitting in C, and if you look at the actual bass line as well, it's only got C and a little inflection of that A sharp. Okay, so I managed to get the melodic aspect of the mode, which is that it has a flat 7. I've managed to incorporate that into the bass line, which is really cool. But there's no chord progression. I never shift the bass note to any note but C. So this is just in one chord. It's in the one chord of C Mixolydian. Right? It's just C Mixolydian is the chord, the only chord in this piece. Okay, very cool. All right, now we could do that for days, for hours. It's just write little riffs that have the key signature, that stick to the intervals in Mixolydian, which is C, D, E, F, G, A sharp, and C, but don't actually chord progress. There's no chord progression, because in order to progress chords, I've got to have a root note change that's lower than or different to C. Okay? And we're going to look at the theory of that shortly. But that's pretty much a summary of how Mixolydian sounds, what notes it contains, and how we can use it, particularly when there's only C in the bass, just to get this like swelling, dreamy feel that's inherent in Mixolydian. And that's how you can achieve it just by using a single chord, yeah? You can just have C in the bass and you can just float using this interval series. And it has this kind of dreamy, floaty feel. No matter how you do it, it's always got that feel that Mixolydian has.